Good to have you back, George. Thanks for taking the time to be here. I appreciate it.
Hi, Sheila. How are you?
I am happier that you're here now, trying to parse through some of this, the Synod talk. George, it's, of course, earlier in the week we heard the word earthquake everywhere and saw it in the New York Times and everywhere else, including the Catholic world. And now we're seeing more rumors, and the warring cardinals sort of meme went on for a while now. So before the Synod even began, George, you published a very fine article, Wanted, a Synod of Affirmation. And you gave that some very good advice to the members of the Synod. Think positive. What think you, George Weigel, at this point late in the second week?
Sheila, I think there will be a robust, I hope compelling, affirmation of the beauty of the Christian idea of marriage and the family coming out of the Synod. I do think the Synod has, in some sense, been hijacked by bishops from, frankly, dying churches in Northern Europe who somehow feel themselves obliged to impose what they believe are pastoral solutions to difficult problems on the entire church, even though their own churches show no real sense of vitality. And that argument, usually conducted according to the typical Roman proprieties, broke out into the open this week with the release of an extraordinarily badly done interim report, which was simply a kind of log or a kind of book report on what the themes of the conversation in the Synod had been up to that date. But this was immediately seized upon by a lot of the mainstream media, a lot of the Catholic left, as the moment when the long-awaited great Catholic cave-in had happened. It hadn't happened. I don't think it's going to happen. But we had 24 hours in the news cycle where, people who really ought to know better, I'm thinking of Father James Martin of America Magazine in particular, were proposing this as some extraordinary change in the Church's self-understanding, the change in the Church's pastoral approach, all of which simply feeds into the caricature of the Catholic Church as a bunch of cranky old men who don't like people in difficult human situations and are mean and nasty to them. That is slander. And when Catholic commentators, moving their own agendas, contribute to the perpetuation of that caricature, I think they need to be called to task, and that's what I tried to do in my piece in National Review Online yesterday.
And by the way, I want to tell folks, and that's linked on the show page, that piece in National Review Online is excellent. It's called The Great Catholic Cave-In That Wasn't. George brings clarity to the fact that, as it's subheaded or subtitled, the little tagline says, The Times, New York Times, wishful thinking notwithstanding, the Synod of Bishops hasn't thrown out church teaching. So, George, that's something to kind of get really clear and established up front, because I know some Catholics who are hand-wringing and very worried, talking to me at events, writing to me in the inbox, very worried about church teaching changing. The thing that the way I understand it, and that most of the reasonable heads I've heard explain it, is that church teaching not only hasn't so far changed, it's not going to change. Church teaching itself.
But there is a confusion, Sheila, and it's manifest even in a highly intelligent man like Cardinal Walter Casper. There is a confusion about the fact that church teaching, which Casper admits is unchangeable, on these matters like the indissolubility of marriage, the nature of human love, etc., that teaching is embodied in practices. It's embodied in moral norms. It's embodied in the Church's legal code. This notion that there's some gulf between doctrine and practice is a false idea. The Church's teaching on who can, with a correct conscience, present themselves for Holy Communion is not a mere legal matter. It's a matter of canon law that is rooted in the Church's understanding of the nature of the Eucharist and the clear, biblically based understanding that those who eat and drink the body and blood of the Lord unworthily are eating and drinking themselves into condemnation, as St. Paul said. So that's a big confusion. The other confusion that I'm glad has come to the surface, because now we can really go to the mat on this. These Northern European bishops seem not to have understood that conceding to the zeitgeist, conceding to the sexual revolution, which they have been trying to do ever since Humanae Vitae, is one of the reasons why their churches are empty. There is no future for dumbed-down Catholicism in this culturally challenging moment. Now, does that mean that the church becomes this small rump of the purified? No. This is a church of sinners. You, me, all of us have need of the divine mercy, which we find in the sacrament of reconciliation or penance. But the notion that the way you deal with this cultural tsunami that is sweeping across the Western world is to bend before it is foolishness of the first order. And that is what the African bishops are saying to the Europeans. Don't you impose Western decadence on us, and good for them for saying it.
Oh, I agree, George. In fact, on that, I'm so glad you brought that up, because so to reset from your piece, to, as you just said, but from your article ahead of the Synod, wanted a Synod of affirmation. Right in the second paragraph, you said, and just as the Christian understanding, which you just said a moment ago, but to repeat, just as the Christian understanding of marriage is beginning to gain traction in Africa, where it is experienced as a liberating dimension of the gospel, European theologians from dying local churches are trying to empty marriage of its covenantal character, reducing it to another form of a contract. Therefore, when Nigerian Archbishop Ignatius Kaigama came out the other day, not excoriating, but certainly criticizing Western attitudes at the Synod and saying, we're confronted, essentially saying, don't come down here and offer us aid, telling us we have to think like you. We have to assume your ideas on marriage and human life and when human life begins. We think for ourselves. We know when that time is. We know how we understand marriage. And I'm like, right on, Your Excellency, tell it. You tell it. Well, now...
And
go ahead.
Today there was this extraordinary interview with Cardinal Casper released,
right,
in which he basically told the Africans, shut up, we're not listening to you. An utterly astonishing act of arrogance, which I hope he is severely called to task for publicly. This kind of business has got to stop. And I don't care how distinguished a theologian he is, that statement today, well, we don't really listen to them because they have these taboos about homosexuality.
Right, that's what Cardinal Casper said.
Is scandalous. And I'm frankly glad it's out in the open. But now it needs to be responded to by brother bishops and cardinals. It needs to be taken to the woodshed.
And I was going to ask you, who would that be, as you say, brother bishops and cardinals? And
it's their primary responsibility. I mean, you and I can, raise Cain about such... frankly, racism. I mean, I hate, using that term because it's so overused in our culture. But I mean, this was a real act of, to put it fairly neutrally, cultural snobbery. You underlings don't tell us educated people what to do.
Yeah, it was breathtaking. And just to let listeners know what you mean when you say now it's out there on the record. Zenit, there was an interview with Edward Penton, who's been on this program several times, in Zenit. And Zenit.org's got the article, Cardinal Casper, the headline, Growing Majority in Synod. Well, that's a different story. But within the story about what Cardinal Casper is saying about the Synod, he literally is on the record in this interview suggesting that African views on homosexuality, where the issue remains a taboo, says the article, are not listened to by the Western delegates in that assembly. As George just pointed out, how gasping a statement that is. And then Cardinal Casper noted how impossible it is for Western delegates to comment on African issues. He said, quote, they should not tell us too much what we have to do. Again, it's unseemly. It really should be responded to. It's out there now. And this is the kind of stuff, George, that's causing a lot of Catholics a lot of nervousness. We've got to go to a break right now, but coming back on the other side, I want to pick up right there about that worrying, the cause of the confusion and a lot of chaos. Secular media, one thing. What the New York Times says, one thing. We'll clarify that as well. But what's being said within the Catholic world, I want your opinion, George Weigel. And my listeners, really, right now, I urge you all to go to the show page, click on George's article. It's very clarifying. And everybody, take a deep breath and calm down and don't go away. We'll be right back. It's one thing, the interview we just talked about in Zenit with the warring cardinals, because Cardinal Burke has an interview in Catholic World Report in which he expresses, again, on the record, his concern for, some of the things that are coming out. He expressed concern over several aspects of the Synod, including the push for changes in the handling of communion and for divorced and remarried Catholics. And, George, he expressed concern for the way that information about the Synod is being, in his words, manipulated. What do you think about that?
Sheila, I think it would be helpful if your listeners and all serious Catholics would do a couple of things. First, understand that there is a media trope out there according to which the Catholic Church will eventually cave in to the sexual revolution like the rest of mainline, old-line Protestantism did over the past 50 years. That is set in concrete. You can't change that, except in some circumstances. I think my NBC colleagues have been quite good on understanding that some stuff just isn't up for alteration here. But the New York Times and everybody who listens to the New York Times needs to understand this. That just isn't going to change. So that you have to read this stuff with appropriate skepticism because it's all getting filtered through that expectation. Second thing I think people need to understand is that there really are genuine arguments in the Church about how best to respond pastorally to the cultural meltdown of the Western world. Now, it would help if some of our friends on the Catholic left would recognize that this is in fact a cultural meltdown and not cultural development. I mean, that seems to be the illusion under which Casper and others are operating, that there's something, this is history moving forward. No, it's the Western world collapsing in terms of its moral foundations. And then the question becomes, how do you address that? But you can't have a good argument about how to address it unless you've got the nature of the problem identified correctly. The third thing I think people need to understand is that the Catholic Church today has an armamentarium, a kit bag of really extraordinary materials to meet this challenge from an imploding culture. And those materials, I think, unfortunately, have not been very well deployed at this Synod. I'm thinking about the apostolic letter Familiaris Consortio of John Paul II. I'm thinking about John Paul II's Theology of the Body. I'm thinking about all of the work that has been done in American dioceses in getting marriage preparation done in a serious, catechetically serious way. I'm thinking about the good work done by American tribunals in dealing with complex marital cases. We have a lot of problems in the Church in the United States. We do this stuff better than anybody. We need to say that. We need to make that available to people. We need to share our canonical expertise with others around the world. But above all, we need to share our pastoral expertise and our understanding that the only Catholicism that's got a shot amidst this cultural tsunami is all in Catholicism. Compassionate, merciful, but fully convicted that the truth the Church bears is the truth the world needs to hear for the world's sake.
Which is what you said originally in your first article right before the Synod began, wanted a Synod of affirmation. Short piece, but an excellent one, George, in which you urged the Synod Fathers to think positive and to focus on the positive. And when we look at the week and a half that's gone by, though the documents themselves of the discourse that's taken place behind closed doors, as this has been structured, is not for us to yet know or read. There is that one document that came out, and then those cardinals and bishops who give press conferences or who give interviews. But it doesn't sound like that they have really focused on the positive, and yet some say they're trying to by changing the tone, the pastoral tone and approach to peoples of the world. I read an interesting, Catherine Jean Lopez put it in an article on one of her pieces in National Review Online, and George, I thought it was brilliant, is where she took a snip that was a papal quote, and it was a quote on how to pastorally approach persons of same-sex attraction, homosexuals. I forget how it was put, but it was a beautiful papal, not what, advice. And then after that quote, she said, that was a quote by Pope Benedict XVI. And so this is not something that's new, and yet what are they saying in the Synod? That we need to not change church, well, some are saying that change church teaching, but to approach people in what you call correctly the cultural meltdown in a different way so that they will now be open to us?
Sheila, I think we can always think better, more carefully about how you speak the truth in love.
Absolutely.
I think
Amen.
It is true, as I did in my chapter on Brideshead Revisited in Letters to a Young Catholic, that there is, to adopt an image from very ancient spiritual theology, there's a ladder of love that we climb, from lesser loves to higher and more noble and more true loves. But that has to be presented as a call to conversion. We try to find what's good in people's objectively irregular situations in order to help them see that those good things call them to a deeper conversion and a different situation. I mean, that's what's getting lost in all of this, is the idea of ongoing conversion.
Well,
and you can't present gradualism as if this were simply taking people where they are and leaving them there. Of course you begin pastorally with where people are. Where else would you begin? But the whole point of beginning there is to try to find a step on that ladder of love that can invite people to take a higher step, a step up.
And that's a beautiful way to put gradualism or graduality in its proper context, because that's another buzzword of this entire Synod, and it's being misdefined and redefined and applied by different people in different ways. But you just put it so well.
Let me just put a word in here in fraternal correction to my good buddy John Allen. John is saying this is a Synod of lifestyle ecumenism. No, this is a Synod. We have ecumenical dialogue. We recognize that there are elements of grace and truth, as the Council teaches, in other Christian communities. Why? In order to have a foundation in which we can be in conversation with them and they can come to a fuller communion with the Catholic Church. The same applies in these lifestyle situations. It's about conversion.
Oh, it's always about conversion. So well put. George Weigel, thank you so much for being here. Weigel, thank you so much for being here. Weigel, thank